Giving difficult feedback to employees can be stressful for a lot of people. Whether it's because you don't want to hurt their feelings or because you're worried that it might turn into a tense situation, it can be something that adds a lot of stress to your job. In a perfect world, you'd be able to give the feedback you need to give, and the other person would simply take it well, and you could all just move on, right? In this video, I'm going to give my best tips for giving difficult feedback to an employee, including how, when, and what to say without the other person getting defensive. Be sure to stay to the end, where I give a few examples of exactly how I start these conversations and how to approach the difficult feedback you need to give, so don't miss out. Hi, it's Julie, your conversation expert. I teach highly driven professionals the communication and leadership skills needed to uplevel their careers. Today, we're covering giving feedback, which is one of the cornerstone skills you need to have in order to be a great leader. If becoming a great leader is important to you, please grab your free copy of my Leadership Skills Checklist. In it, I cover a wide range of skills that you will need in order to maximize your career success and be a great leader in your field. Check out the link in the description below to get your copy today. In order to be set up for success when it comes to giving difficult feedback to an employee, the when is going to be our first consideration. First of all, if you have corrective feedback you need to give to an employee, it needs to be done soon after you notice that there's a problem. Please don't take this to mean that I'm giving you permission to nitpick every single thing that somebody does. And also, please take note of the difference between something that violates company policy or state law versus something that you simply don't like because it's not how you would have done it. The more you can be flexible about the things that can be flexible, the better. There should always be a solid, logical reason behind why you need something changed or done differently, not just because it's how you would do it. Now, you can cite consistency as a legitimate reason why you want something done differently, if it truly makes a difference. For example, at our house, there is one very specific place that everybody puts the TV remote when they're done using it to prevent my husband and I from having to hunt it down every single evening after the kids go to bed. If the remote is always put in the exact place where it's supposed to be, it really cuts down on a lot of frustration, mostly mine. Besides generally giving feedback as soon as you notice that there's a consistent problem, let's also talk time of day. My recommendation is to give feedback early in the day, especially to employees who you know may be prone to anxiety. If this is planned feedback, such as an annual review, you might want to take note that the employee is probably feeling a lot of anxiety and anticipation ahead of this meeting, and planning it for later in the day is just going to result in a very unproductive and anxiety-filled day for them. Get it over with ASAP so that everybody can move on with their day and hopefully actually be productive for the rest of the day. If this is a less formal, off-the-cuff sort of feedback situation, I still recommend getting to it early in the day. Sitting on feedback until the end of the day can make it feel like a bigger deal. It can make it feel like you've been keeping this feedback from somebody all day long. And it also just ends the person's day on a down note. So I recommend getting to it soon so that the rest of the day can be perfectly normal. Do you agree? What time of day do you prefer to get feedback from a supervisor? Let me know in the comments below. When it comes to giving difficult feedback to an employee, how you give this feedback is going to make a huge difference in how well or not the feedback is received. Do what you can to give this feedback in a way that minimizes the stress and anxiety of the other person and maximizes the chance that they're actually going to hear the feedback you're trying to give instead of just being defensive about it. Most feedback should be informational or educational in nature, not punitive or overly critical. If your energy when you're giving this feedback is too businesslike or formal, you are cueing to that other person that this is a really big deal and they're going to treat it that way, mostly in a negative sort of way where they feel very defensive and full of stress, and they're too busy trying to make sure they're not going to get fired to actually hear what you have to say. Pulling them into a closed door, please have a seat sort of a meeting is going to make them think that something really tense is about to happen, and they are going to be way too focused on not being in trouble to hear what you have to say. If it's possible to have a conversation with them in their own environment as opposed to your office, that would be best. Try to keep the feedback in the least formal setting that's still appropriate to the situation. Take the person's age and generation into account here. Different generations have very different ideas about what is considered courteous versus wasteful, and you would do well to take this into consideration when you're deciding how and when to give feedback to a particular employee. Working with the silent generation and baby boomers, as I do every day in my work in home health, I have often heard the criticism, "They turned me down and didn't even have the common decency to tell me to my face." For those generations, it's considered rude, uncaring, and very disrespectful to give bad news or any sort of corrective action without being willing to take the time to have a face-to-face conversation with them. For them, if it's important, you're going to take the time out of your day to tell them to their face. Whereas with millennials, me, and younger generations, it's considered very wasteful and rude to force somebody to take the time out of their day to have an in-person meeting over something that's not life or death, or at least something that could be conveyed in a much more efficient manner through a text message, an email, or a phone call. Gen Xers tend to care a little bit less about the method of feedback and more about getting to the bottom line. Make your point and let's all move on. So when you're choosing your method for giving feedback, take into consideration how serious the situation really is and how likely the person is to receive the way that you're giving them this communication well. Meaning, are you creating anxiety in them because you seem to be making a much bigger deal out of this than it really is? Or could you be offending them by not being willing to take the time to go through something in person if it really means that much to you to be addressed in the first place? Not sure what would work best for them? Just ask. How do you prefer to get feedback? In person or more remotely through a text, email, or phone call? Let me know in the comments below. Bonus points if you share your generation. When it comes to giving difficult feedback to an employee, we've covered the when and the how. Now we need to cover what to say in order to give this feedback without the other person becoming defensive. First, we need to decide how we're going to start things out. Do not send them a message that is so vague as to simply say, "We need to talk," or "We need to have a meeting." Their imagination and probably their anxiety are going to start running wild, and they'll be walking into this meeting in full defense mode. If possible, see if you can have this entire conversation all at once to prevent them from having the time to create a lot of anxiety where it doesn't need to be, and to make this conversation feel more collaborative than punishing. Don't initiate the conversation until you're clear in your mind about the purpose of the conversation and what you're expecting to get out of approaching this person. Here are some examples of conversations that I've had to have with PT assistants who I have supervised in the past. "Hey, I need to ask you about a note that you wrote on Mrs. So-and-so after your last visit. It sounds like she was really upset, and I'm trying to figure out what's going on." In this case, the person had written something in the patient's note that was not professional and could have created a lot of problems down the road in certain situations. I needed to know what had happened so that I could help to handle the actual situation with the patient, but I also needed to make sure that this person knew how the situation should have been handled, how it should have been charted, and how I would prefer to have had it communicated with me in the future. I framed the purpose of this conversation as needing to get clear on what exactly happened, because that was very important to me for several reasons. I didn't want to have a conversation with the patient about what had happened until I was clear about what had happened from the perspective of my PT assistant. And very clearly, I was going to need to have a conversation with my patient about what had happened. I also needed to understand if a change of personnel was going to be required about who was seeing this patient. And I needed to get clear on the thought process, or lack of one, behind why the chart was notated in the way that it was. Jumping to conclusions, attacking the PTA, or getting overly focused on the documentation instead of the situation would have all been bad moves. I want my PT assistants to feel like they can come to me when something goes wrong because they know I'm going to help them. And I want them to feel like they can trust me and that I'm here to support them. After taking the time to get the whole story from the PTA, I could see why they were so frustrated. It was a pretty legitimate thing to be frustrated about. I offered to take that patient off the PT assistant's caseload so that they wouldn't have to go back and see them anymore. But they assured me that they'd had time to calm down and they'd had time to think about it and they were willing to keep seeing the patient. But I told them that if they changed their minds, I completely understood and to please let me know so that I could make that change at any point going forward. Only then did I bring up the documentation itself. What I said to them was, I definitely understand how frustrating that all was, and I would have been equally as frustrated, but we still need to go over how the whole thing was worded in the patient's chart. At that point, they just said, I know I shouldn't have done that. I'm really sorry. Look, if they know what the problem is, I don't need to keep pushing about it. So I just put a cap on the situation by saying, I get that you were frustrated, but you know that these are technically legal documents and they're part of the patient's permanent medical record. So let's just be careful about what we put in there because it can come back to bite us later, right? And they knew that, and they just said, I know, I'm sorry. So I offered, next time, if you need to rant about a patient, just tell me. I'll be more than happy to hear all of it. But let's just not document it, okay? Problem solved, right? I needed to know what might need to be changed about the patient's plan of care. I also needed to not walk into that patient's home completely blindsided by not knowing exactly what had happened. I needed to know what my PT assistant needed from me as far as support goes or any changes that we might need to make. And I needed to make sure that we had a better plan of action so that if something like this happened again, I didn't have to worry about the patient's chart being notated the way that it had been this time. The issue with the documentation was a symptom of a larger problem. It needed to be addressed and corrected, but it didn't need to be the sole focus of this conversation. My PT assistant had been stressed out, overwhelmed, and really frustrated. They made a bad choice. We just needed to have a better action plan for what to do instead if it ever came up again. Bill, do you have a minute? I want us to go over a couple of patients and make sure we're on the same page when it comes to their plan of care. I've got a few people here who I'm seeing a lot of plateauing in their progress, and I just want to go over what sort of interventions you're doing with them to make sure that we're on the same page and to brainstorm what we might need to adjust. Now, in this case, I was getting multiple complaints from several different patients about one particular PT assistant. The general consensus was that this guy was really phoning in what he was doing when he was in the patient's homes. And the patients were feeling really frustrated that they weren't getting the level of therapy that they thought they should be getting. I needed him to step up a lot more. But instead of focusing the conversation on the patient complaints, on me coming out of the gate basically accusing him of being lazy, or getting into an argument about what he was or wasn't doing when he was seeing the patient, I made the focus of the conversation all about the patient progress, or lack thereof. I'd already heard about what was going on from the perspective of the patient. It was only fair for me to hear about it from Bill's perspective too, right? So before I just started right out of the gate with what I thought he needed to be doing differently, I wanted to give him the opportunity to explain to me what was going on. So I started with the first patient. Can you tell me what's been going on with Mrs. So-and-so? What all have you been doing with her when you've been seeing her? His answer was vague, something like, oh, you know, just the basics. From this response, it could have gone one of two ways. He could have known that he was phoning in what he was supposed to be doing. He knew he was caught, and he wasn't about to incriminate himself by saying something that wasn't true. Or he legitimately thought that just doing the basics was acceptable. So I prodded a little bit more to try to figure out which one was the case. I said, well, we've been seeing her for a few weeks at this point, and I was expecting her to be a lot further along in her progress than this. I think we should be well past the basics with her and moving on to the next steps. What were you planning on doing with her next? His answer was kind of fumbled for a few minutes, and he was honestly just giving me a lot of vague stabs at what he thought I wanted him to say. The fact that he didn't have a clear answer about what he was planning to do next made me start to think that he might need a lot more hand-holding than I had originally assumed. He had been a PT assistant a lot longer than I had been a PT, and I had assumed that he would have a lot more in the way of initiative and problem-solving skills, but that didn't really seem to be the case. So I decided to ask him about the next patient. Okay, well, Mr. So-and-so is 2 weeks out from a total knee replacement, and I was definitely thinking his range of motion should be better now than what it is. What sort of things have you been doing to work on his knee range of motion? Again, his answer was pretty vague and fumbling. Now I was really starting to have some red flags going up because I was starting to realize he didn't have a plan for what to do with this patient. And considering that rehabbing a patient after a total knee replacement is pretty much the bread and butter of our profession, I felt like I needed to press a little further to really figure out what was going on in his head. So I decided to ask a broader question. Well, what sorts of range of motion exercises do you usually do after a patient's had a knee replacement? He said, well, Sarah, who's another PT, usually has me do these exercises, and he explained a few. At this point, I was pretty confused at the lack of carryover between what he would be doing with a different patient versus the patient that we were seeing together. Again, especially considering that rehabbing somebody after this type of surgery is one of the most basic and common things that you can expect to do as a physical therapist, and something that he should have been very well aware of what to do without me giving him play-by-play instructions on exactly which exercises I wanted him to do. So I asked the only question I could think of at this point. Well, if that's what you do with Sarah's patients after a total knee replacement, why haven't you done that with Mr. So-and-so yet? And he looked me straight in the face and said, because you didn't tell me to. There was no sarcasm. He was completely serious. So this was the day that I learned. This particular person needs explicit permission and instructions on what to do with every single patient that we see, no matter how repetitive or obvious it might seem to me. Okay, lesson learned. After my conversation with Bill, I went to Sarah to ask her what her experience had been working with Bill. Her comment to me was, oh yes, that's just how he is. You have to tell him exactly what to do with every single patient, or otherwise, he's not going to do anything. It's just how he is. But if you tell him what you want done, he'll do it every time. Okay, well, now I know. This was an example of keeping the dialogue open when you're giving feedback to someone. In order to truly lead people and to build trust and have good communication in your relationships with the people that you supervise, you have to be ready to improvise how the situation needs to be handled. Bill wasn't being lazy. In his head, he was waiting for me to tell him exactly what I wanted him to do, and I hadn't done that yet. He was waiting for me to make the next move, just as he was used to Sarah doing with him. If I had accused him of being lazy, I could have really damaged my relationship with him. I could have caused a lot of hurt feelings and resentment and created a tense situation with me supervising him from that point forward that I might not have been able to fix. I also could have ended up feeling like the biggest jerk who ever lived by accusing him of doing something wrong on purpose, basically, just for the conversation to end up that he was waiting on me to make a move that I wasn't making. He wasn't the type of person to take it on himself to assume what I wanted done with the patient. And in his mind, he was doing the right thing by me and the patient by waiting for specific instructions before he changed anything about what he was doing. And by law, he's not supposed to do interventions with the patient that weren't ordered. His interpretation of that was way more literal and specific than it would typically be with anyone else. But again, in his mind, he was just following the rules and doing the right thing. The lesson here is that sometimes people need you to be a different leader than the kind of leader that you naturally are. Or they prefer a different style of leadership than you prefer in the people who are supervising you. And that's okay. The best leaders are the ones who can recognize this and adjust. Giving feedback can be a tricky and sometimes emotional skill to master. There's a balance between keeping things orderly and suffocating the people who work under you. If you'd like to work on your feedback skills or on any of the skills listed in my free leadership skills checklist, I invite you to sign up for a free 30-minute discovery call with me about my one-on-one VIP coaching package. This package is custom tailored to you for your needs that are the most pressing at the moment, and I'd love to have a conversation with you about what I can do to help. You can go to yourconversationexpert.com/coaching to learn more or sign up for that free discovery call. There are also links in the description below. I hope that you've enjoyed today's video and that you've found it to be very helpful. If you have, it would help me out a lot if you would give the video a like and maybe tag or share it with someone who you think could benefit. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel so that you don't miss a video, including my next one, which is all about what to say when someone shares bad news and how to be kind without feeling awkward. In the meantime, please check out these other very helpful videos. Again, this is Julie, your conversation expert, and I'm here to help you. So let me know what kind of content you need for me to create so that I can give you the things that you need to set you up for success. I'll see you next week.